The new Harvard Youth poll is out, and it spells doom for the Democratic Party apparatus. President Joe Biden fares well among 18 to 29-year-olds in a generic ballot. 41% say they'd go to the polls on Election Day for Biden, while 30% say the same of Donald Trump.
But that number gets squashed once third parties come into the fray. 29% of youth choose Biden for their next president in that scenario, 25% for Trump, 10% would cast their ballots for RFK Jr., 3% for Cornel West, and a whopping 31% say they don't know.
But perhaps an even more damning data point, the number of young Americans who definitely plan to vote for president decreased from 57% to 49% in a poll at a similar point in the 2020 election cycle.
Yeah, so what emerges, again, is not necessarily young people who are Democrats moving into the Republican camp, but being so disenchanted and disaffected with Joe Biden, knowing that they will have other options. Young voters are the voters most likely to actually follow through on a third-party threat. Older voters, are more loyal to the two main parties for whatever reason. They watch more cable news that reinforces a kind of duopoly, I think, mode of thinking about American politics, whereas young voters get to have their news sources from a lot more diverse places, like our little show, and social media and a lot of other things. So they're, I think, more. I'm not saying they're more open-minded overall or like ideologically open-minded, but they are more open-minded specifically for using their vote in a strategic way, not for one of the major parties. I think that is pretty clear. Yeah, so this is a lot of, there's some real concern here.
There are also some specific movements that people are starting to take advantage, I think, of the specific frustration folks have had over Joe Biden's kind of unqualified support, both in terms of military aid and financial assistance to Israel. In Michigan, specifically, Democrats have warned the White House about how this can negatively affect them in that state, given the large Arab American community there. And now there is an abandoned Biden movement that's specifically lobbying voters or helping voters to aggregate and organize themselves to apply real pressure on Joe Biden to change his public policy. One of the leaders told the Associated Press, "The anger in our community is beyond belief. One of the things that made us even more angry is the fact that most of us actually voted for President Biden. I even had one incident where a religious leader asked me, how do I get my 2020 ballot so I can destroy it?" So this isn't like some of the other people who you might typically find voting for third-party candidacies. I mean, so many of us who have voted third-party in the past have had to explain to folks the Democratic Party was never going to get our vote because we're fundamentally decoupled from the two-party duopoly. But this is a more dangerous threat to Joe Biden because these are people who have already demonstrated their willingness and likelihood, frankly, in the past to vote for a Democratic candidate or Joe Biden specifically, who are saying, this is a red line I'm not going to cross.
Yeah. It's theoretically possible, of course. Joe Biden is just in a kind of, I think, a bad position because of what's going on with Israel-Palestine. I mean, it's theoretically possible that he's going to lose votes regardless of the stance, because if
calling for a ceasefire, you think would cause him to lose votes? I'm
saying he could lose Jewish votes for appearing to be not supportive of Israel. No, I mean, you might say that's fine and that's what he should do, but it's theoretically possible, right?
It's also 66% of Americans support a ceasefire. So if you're going to lose one way or the other, strategically, I would think you would want to side with the majority of your constituents. Sure, I'm not saying he shouldn't do that, but if you look specifically at now Michigan actually has the highest Arab population, I think, of any state in the country. I just looked it up. It's over 200,000. There's 80,000-ish Jewish people in Michigan. I imagine some of the other swing states, it's probably closer, or there might be more Jewish people in some of those. And the number of Arab Americans in Michigan is larger than the victory margin that Joe Biden won by in that state.
Yes, yeah.
I
think he's in a bad, I think he's in a bad position. I think he could lose some support regardless of the stance he takes, because there's real dissent in his coalition on how this matter should be handled, given that a lot of, now Jewish voters have been moving into the Republican Party. They used to be pretty ironclad supporters of the Democratic Party. I think they could, if he, but I'm not saying what he should do policy-wise. I'm just from a pure politics lens, I could see Jewish voters becoming much more solidly Republican if he tried to appease
what we're talking about here
Islamic
is
voters.
the pattern of young voters. And I don't think that what you're seeing in the numbers here with young voters fleeing for candidates like Cornel West or even RFK Jr. is an indication that they're more interested in the Republican Party. What it seems like is that they're probably captured by the themes that are represented by all these independent candidates, calling out corporate corruption, calling out the corporate duopoly, calling out what they perceive to be authoritarianism at the highest ranks of government, being supportive of common sense social policies. RFK Jr. is an environmentalist who worked for 30 years as an environmental lawyer. Cornel West obviously is a progressive across the board who supports overwhelmingly popular policies like Medicare for All, which 88% of Democrats support,
but
despite there
RFK
being
Jr.
absolutely no appetite for it within the Democratic Party.
As you've pointed out a lot, including in conversations with him on the show, RFK Jr. is actually very supportive of Israel.
He is.
So the fact that it can't be that that's the only issue. He's winning support from Biden, even from young people for a lot of other reasons too.
Yeah, but I'm going specifically to your argument about, whether or not Jewish voters are going conservative. Young voters are not.
No.
And so when we're looking at these polls about what young voters are up to and why it is that Joe Biden has lost that coalition, which historically has been very solidly in the Democratic Party camp, I think you have to look at these other issues. Now, I agree. I don't think that it's just Israel. RFK Jr. got a lot of flack from his conservative base over this, but he also came out in support of student debt cancellation. A lot of people, whatever you think of the value of the policy, feel like Joe Biden not only reneged on his promise to cancel student debt, using it as an inducement to get people to the polls in midterms last year before ending the student debt moratorium as a bargaining chip over one of the debt ceiling conversations. So at the end of the day, even if you think that he's not responsible for the Supreme Court knocking down his program, he definitely made the decision to start debt, which is something that he could have left for Republicans. He didn't have to be the one that did it. And I think a lot of young voters, even if the media has moved on, absolutely have not forgotten about what they see as a betrayal there.
I mean, I think he's managing of course, both political coalitions, the major parties have some internal contradictions or have some people with conflicting aims. The question is, can he manage that in an effective way? And I think the answer so far we're seeing is that no, he can't, that he is himself not a popular enough figure to overcome some of those, the fighting within the group, and that there are also serious questions about his fitness for office, given his advanced age, at a time where the Democratic media, mainstream media, wants to make the election all about Trump, the likely candidate on the other side, his unfitness for office. At the same time, they're running a candidate with just obvious and galling deficiencies, not of exactly the same kind, but of a similar, can this person even do the job sort of concern. Yeah,
what was interesting, I mentioned this in another segment, that Pod Save America, which is a podcast hosted by 4 former Obama speechwriters, I think all of them, maybe just most of them were Obama speechwriters. They had Dean Phillips on, who's running, obviously, in the Democratic primary. And they kept asking him, if you are politically identical to Joe Biden, if you vote along with him 100% of the time, what is the point of you? Are you just Joe Biden but younger? And they meant that as kind of an indictment of his campaign. And he kind of leaned into that framing of it and was like, well, here are some other policy things that I differ with Biden on. But I, listening to it, remember thinking, who cares? One of Biden's biggest liability is that he's simply old. So if all he has to offer is that he's literally Joe Biden but younger, that's actually a lot. And he was making this pitch about how unlikely it is for Joe Biden to win based on these statistics. And if being younger can actually overcome that hurdle, then I say kudos to him.
Joe Biden, but younger, won the last election. Joe Biden was a couple years younger.
Exactly.
It's not a that's not a diss at all. That's it clearly. That's a candidate that has some proven national appeal.
Right.
And he's losing that appeal because he has gotten to be too old. Yep. Very interesting. Well, that does it for us for today. Tomorrow on Rising, journalist and writer Rob Aurora will be back for a new report on the government's role in promoting the COVID vaccine. You won't want to miss that.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while you're on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
See you tomorrow.
Take care.